might as well call us to order. So where did I put my agenda?
The recording has started.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is the Board of Finance Special Audit Subcommittee meeting for Tuesday, June 23rd, 2020. This is a special meeting, and we have a very small agenda, but I will call our meeting to order. It is 6:03, and can we rise to say the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, with liberty and justice.
With liberty and justice.
Okay. So item 3 on our agenda is to review and discuss the Town of Fairfield, Connecticut Public Works Department review report on the results of the procedures performed and to make recommendations to the Board of Finance at the July 7th, 2020 Board of Finance meeting. So I guess I'll begin. I didn't specifically request that Joe and Caitlin and Connie come tonight because I will ask them to be at the July 7th meeting, and Jim has already asked them to be at the Board of Finance meeting. So I thought this was a good opportunity for just the Audit Committee to digest the report and decide where we think we need to go with this, what we should be undertaking and following up on, and what the Board of Finance, if we need to make recommendations to the Board of Finance on things we need to do, and also what we want to recommend that administration and the Finance Department do and report back to us. So I thought it would just be more of a general discussion on how we want to approach things. And so I hope to kind of develop a list of what we would like to do and what our priorities are. Does that seem to work for everyone?
That works, Mary. So where would you like to begin as far as the audit report goes? Would you like to start with the review of the accounting policies, or do you want to go back to the appendix and look at the recommendations?
Well, I was thinking that maybe flipping back to the appendix might be the best place to start. Because Joe has now put some priorities in for us and what he deems is most important. And so I don't know that we'd have time to go through every single item, but we could we can get a feel for the different priorities, what his intentions were with them, and then and what we think needs to be done with them. Because some of them seem like they should, hopefully they've already been taken care of, which Joe has acknowledged in the beginning of his report, but we want to follow through, and someone needs to confirm that they've been resolved and new policies are in place to correct those items. So if you go to, where was it? The very last page of the report, it's appendix page 4 of 4. And at the very bottom is a rating scale. Joe has rated his priorities. 1 is a significant internal control deficiency. 2 is an internal control deficiency. 3, internal control deficiency, not significant area. 4, significant best practice efficiency policy related. 5, best practice efficiency policy. So I think that's really what should kind of guide us, is we want to make sure the most important things get corrected first. And maybe that's what we should discuss first, unless someone has a better idea.
No, I think that makes sense, but I think we should just probably flip through these and make sure that we agree with the characterization on the priority as
Sure.
well. Some of these, as I first read through the report, I highlighted and made stars on ones that sort of caught my eye, and I noticed that some of the ones that I thought were more significant they've been labeled in a variety of ways. 1, 2, 3. Some are called a best practice, but I thought they more related to, a financial risk. So it would be helpful if he could, when we go through them with him, I'd like him to understand his thinking. I think this is very helpful, and maybe this is what we'll end up with. But if we were to flip through, as we go through these, like if we go back through the beginning of the report and we look at the first section, I think he has, so the first section on page 3, this is recommendations for strengthening internal controls and upgrading procedures to best practices. So, as I looked at this, the couple of things that caught my eye were, for example, letter D, and that says, checks and cash receipts are sent to the divisions, being sent directly to the finance department. That's labeled a 2. But as, when I look at something like that, to me, that signals that we don't, and there are also other comments in other places that indicate that there aren't reconciliations being done between what's collected in the division and what's actually gets into the bank. So to me, that's a completeness issue. I look at item D, I look at item K, credit card payments are not an option for all fees, so we're taking cash. And I look at N, where the finance department doesn't have access to the software used for fees collected in Parks and Recs and Public Works. And when I look at those 3 in particular, the reason they caught my eye is, again, how do we, to play devil's advocate, how do we know that all the money collected in the town actually ends up in the town's bank account? That's the crux of these recommendations, right? To make sure that money collected there's a complete accounting for it, and that it's reconciled to what goes in the bank. And so those 3
and that someone doesn't.
Right. They're sort of labeled differently.
Segregated.
Yeah. I mean, I looked at those 3 as that's controlled to make sure that we account for all the cash that's coming in properly. And, then the other one was, item F. I mean, it talks about training. So it says employees lack adequate training on town policies and procedures, most notably the purchasing policy. And it's training, okay, but and I'm glad to see he rated it as a 2 here, but that gets to making sure we have the right policies for money that goes out the door. So as I look at these, I think his legend, identifies things correctly in terms of, can these things have a direct financial impact, or are they more efficiency and best practice type recommendations? But for a few of them, I couldn't, I wasn't quite sure how we got to the priority, and it may be just based upon the dollars involved, which is not necessarily clear in the report. I did go back and look at our budget book, though, and as I look at the Public Works revenue budget, it's not small. It's over $3 million, if I've got that right. And so, well, it's actually in a couple of pieces, because it's solid waste is over 3 million. And then we've got a little bit more that's labeled Public Works. Then, of course, all the Parks and Recs revenue, which is quite a bit more, I think comes through the same system.
Right.
So, this is not, these are not insignificant amounts of money. And so, collectively, a lot of these circle around the same issue, which is that we are taking in money in various places throughout the town, cash, checks, whatever. Some of this is coming in without any sort of invoice being issued. Some of it is coming in on a system that's disconnected from the finance system and not reconciled.
Right.
And so as a broader issue, I think that's, one, and this goes beyond public works, obviously. So I think as a broader issue, really getting an understanding of, all these places where we are taking in money and understanding, how we can put better controls around that to make sure that all that money is actually accounted for. There seems to be a lot of holes in the process and a lot of risk, frankly.
Right.
So
it seems like both ends, the money coming in and then the money going out. But,
yeah, the money going out is a whole separate issue, but I mean, a lot of that is, clearly there's a number of problems there, but the money coming in, I was uncomfortable with that, and that's why even with a recommendation like item K on page 3, where we say credit card payments are not currently a payment option. I'm not so sure that's just an efficiency recommendation, because again, we're not, we have different departments that are taking COD payments and not issuing an invoice. I mean, how do we know where that money goes?
Yeah.
It's just.
Right. Less cash is always better.
Yeah. So collectively, I feel like that's sort of a big topic on the one side, is to make sure that, we do it. And likewise, there were also a couple of comments in here, and we can page through because I don't want to jump around. But there was another comment in here that talked about, let me just see if I can find it. You know what, it was on the tip of my tongue and now I can't,
right.
We'll have to look at it as we go through, but
part of this, it's going to take us a long time to really fully understand this report. You can't just read it in a couple days and understand everything that's in here. It's taken me some time to really follow it.
Yeah, I've read it a couple times. That's why I asked in the last meeting if the finance department or someone could take this and put it in a matrix format, so that for each recommendation, we have a box that says, here's the recommendation, here's the status. If the town says they've already corrected this and we know they've dealt with some of these, the status is either it's fixed, it's in process, it's a high priority to be fixed, medium priority, low priority, et cetera. And then when it's, we can just track how these things are moving along. And then as they get remediated, that can, I think, help form some thinking around what Connie does. And maybe she goes back and looks at some of these things to ensure that the recommendations that were actually implemented got done correctly. So I hear you, because otherwise this report, it's just, there's so much here. And so many things are interrelated that it's hard to wrap your head around it.
And some of the things, if you fix it in one place, you need to do it almost town-wide, I would say. That the same policy should apply for every department.
Yeah. Oh, I know the other thing I was going to mention. There was one, and I think it might be in this rec track system, which is also used for Parks and Rec, but there's a comment in here that says the DPW director can basically go in and process any transaction. So they can, let's say they're taking revenue in, they can cancel something, they can void something. I mean, there's just no separation of duties at all, which is
Right, okay.
crazy. And again, no reconciliation of those transactions in that cash to what happens in the finance department. So, those are things that are, I think somewhat alarming, because those are very basic things. I mean, if we collect cash and someone's given a permit, and then you can have someone that can go in the system we have no ability to trace who logged in and did this, and they can cancel the transaction, right? So, and just like, keep the cash or something. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. I'm not suggesting that happened. I'm just suggesting that these are very basic controls that are missing. And to your point before, I think they extend or can extend outside the Department of Public Works. So, I see his prioritization, but I almost feel like, the way I thought of it was sort of in a different grouping, like, what's kind of policy and procedures, what's controls around cash collections, what's controls around cash disbursements. But that was my reaction sort of on the policies and procedures, page, because some of these other things, we don't have an electronic time clock system. I think we're working on that. And, that's fine, but that's more of an efficiency issue, potentially. I'm not sure putting in a time clock system is going to take the place of any particular employee. It's just, it's a good thing to do, but, to me, that would be a lower priority, certainly, than some of these other items.
And I'm assuming it stayed in the budget, did it? I know that was one of the things that they wanted in the budget. That didn't get cut, right? Okay.
I don't think it did.
Okay.
I don't know, Jim, what's your...
I don't think it did, but...
like the
I'm
others...
sorry, what was your question?
Yeah, and I think financial controls around cash coming in, financial controls around cash going out the door is sort of another bucket. And then the operational things, there's a lot of really good recommendations in here that I think once there's a new leader in the Public Works Department, this can provide a good roadmap for them. But for example, things like prioritizing the Q alert system and, using scheduling of road maintenance, tracking that in a more efficient manner and using that information to build a budget. Those are all good, good operational recommendations. But I think, the focus to me would be on things that create financial risk. And that includes our purchasing policy. So.
Right. And that's one of the things I think should be one of our top priorities. And I guess Jim can weigh in on this, is whether he wants the audit committee to start that process. Is that's a Board of Finance thing, is that we get to develop the purchasing policy and the bid waiver policy. And I think that needs to be reviewed, what's in place and there definitely needs to be added a reporting mechanism back to the Board of Finance. But I think there's other improvements that could be made to tighten it up.
Yeah, so what I think we have to determine is, what do we want to focus on as an audit committee? Because this report, as you both have stated, is pretty in-depth. And it's almost as if they have to take this department and maybe others, and I'm talking about the administration, if they're going to truly fix this, and break it completely down and rebuild it on sound management practices. Because what looks like has happened over the years is that the department just made up its own rules, and I'm sure some of them work fine, but to your point is, how do we know that the controls that are in place are really effective? And in some areas, there aren't any controls whatsoever. It's just basically based on
Right.
almost an honor system, which isn't going to work.
Right.
So I think there's so much work to do that one thing's for sure is we definitely need a department head too. And I'm not sure where the administration is um, on locating and hiring and interviewing someone. Maybe I'll make a phone call this week and just find out. And so we need to decide what do we want to get involved in, because there's way too much here for us as a committee to try and
Right.
tackle as a whole.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, I think that as a committee, we should focus on the items that have
The cash receipts and such.
yeah, a financial implication versus some of the operational issues, which I think are really important. And I would like to see, in terms of the matrix and the reporting, I would like to see updates on that as time goes on. And I think that those are good things for internal audit to review. But I think anything around, financial policies and procedures, principles around cash coming in, and absolutely around purchasing. So as I look at, some of the purchasing comments here that in the back of the report, it's very clear, for example, that we need to refresh our purchasing policy. There are a lot of holes in it. There are a lot of things that need to be revisited in terms of the policy itself, the documentation that's required, the review that's required. So the policy is problematic in a number of ways, and the policy that we do have is not being followed. And I think that's probably the most disturbing thing from my perspective. The one element of this that I found the most troubling, and I hope that I would hope that the administration focuses on this as a top priority, is what's being done around the bidding and quoting processes, because the report really implies that bids and quotes are being split, perhaps intentionally, to circumvent the policies that are in place. So at one point here, it says that we have a policy that if for a purchase over $3,000, we're supposed to get different quotes. And, it says the pattern the auditors noticed was that you'd have a single vendor and they'd make a bunch of $2,900 purchases and thereby not get any quotes. So, that is, who is responsible for doing that, and is that still going on today? I mean, that should be, somebody needs to be all over that, because if that is being done either out of ignorance or it's being done by intention, there may be a personnel issue involved, but there are very clearly some serious issues. Or, the report also says that they would get quotes after the fact. They'd enter into agreement, and then purchasing would ask for documentation, they'd get quotes after the fact. This is just, and the report, I have to say, was worded pretty strongly to very heavily imply that this is intentional, circumvention of our policy. So this is really problematic.
So it's almost like we're missing the first step. What the budget for the year for that particular purchase is should dictate what procedures they go through. If they know either go bid the item or for the full year, or whether they can bid it on specific little projects, I think that has to be looked at. If you're talking about mowing the parks or and fields for the year, that should be bid out as one large project and not 10 different projects.
Right.
And I don't know if that's what it was or is, or different things that we're subcontracting out. And then to your point, I guess that has to be looked at, what the cost is to hire a subcontractor versus the town doing it ourselves. is another thing that has to be considered in that whole process.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that a number of the issues that were raised here were things that, you know, originally came to the board's attention after the Julian matter. You know, for example, what's our process around having the town attorney review contracts? You know, what's the criteria for that? You know, I think it was a surprise to some people to learn that that was something that went out on an RFP and there wasn't a contract for it. So those are some of the things that are mentioned in here around looking at our actual policy. But there's a laundry list of them. And I think they're all good recommendations. So I think two things, and Jim, either one of you may remember, but with regard to the purchasing policy, it looks like it was last updated in 2011, and the Board of Finance was involved with that. But we do have a provision in our purchasing policy that addresses the issue that we talked about a minute ago. So when we have multiple payments being made to a single vendor, and those payments may be, you know, like the issue I mentioned before, you have a bunch of $2,900 payments to a vendor, and individually they're under our quoting threshold, in the aggregate they exceed that. You know, our policy says that the board can ask for an analysis periodically on those things, on that type of situation, and review it. But I don't believe we've ever done that. So, you know,
because no one's ever reported it to us and told us that that was happening.
Right, but we should ask for it, right? And because we might get back a report that says, you know, the answer is 0, or we've never had that. It just doesn't happen. Everything that went out on a quote, and we don't have any, you know, we don't have anything that aggregates to over $3,000 without a quote. I doubt that's the case, because I'm sure that, you know, you can buy supplies in January and buy some more in July and some in December, and maybe it's perfectly legitimate. Same vendor, small amounts that'll add up to $3,000. But I think the analysis would, you know, we have to ask for it so that, it, you know, we can see if there are routine purchases, you know, made to a single vendor that appear to have the issue that's been identified in this report. And I would recommend to the Board of Finance that we ask for that at a future meeting, kind of in conjunction with, you know, a refresh of the purchasing policy. And just to help me though, when the purchasing policy was last revised, did the Board of Finance took the lead on that in revising it, or did the board just review it?
No, I believe Chris DeWitt met with different department heads, purchasing and the Board of Ed, and he pretty much rewrote the policy, and then he brought it back to the Board of Finance, and I think it went back to the Board of Finance multiple times, and then finally we needed to adopt something, and we adopted it. And I thought the intent was that after a year or two, they were supposed to report back to us and to see how it was working. And we had gotten glowing remarks, I remember, from Dr. Title, how great it was working at the Board of Ed level. And I believe the town was happy as well. And then I don't recall ever going back and discussing it again.
Okay.
I agree, Mary. I think it was too, and Chris DeWitt, you're right. Chris DeWitt led that group. And I don't think we've revisited in the past 9 years, right? 8, 9 years. So
right. Yeah.
it's probably, obviously, it's an excellent time to dive back in and take a look at this policy.
Yeah, and we've got a roadmap here. I mean, the page 42 of the report, actually, I'm looking at the draft, so I hope my page numbers are the same, but there are 18 recommendations listed to address in an update to a purchasing policy. So, you know, and I think that, you know, these were derived based on the auditor's conversations and observations. So, you know, I think we've got a good roadmap here, and you know, I'm not sure what what your thoughts are, but I feel like, maybe an update or a proposed update should come from the town that addresses and incorporates these 18 items rather than having, the board. I mean, the board could have a committee to review it, but the work, kind of the legwork has been done here, and we've got a set of recommendations that looks fairly comprehensive, and they've been developed based on testing that was done. So that should give us some confidence. And I think that, the board should have a project to review it, but I feel like, purchasing should have a hand in actually, writing the revisions, and then have a process to make sure that people get trained, which is the other issue that was raised repeatedly in this report, that employees are not aware of the policy and are not trained on the policy.
Right. Right, that should
Plus-
be part of, the town needs an onboarding procedure, and that the financial, the internal controls that for their position should be part of that.
Yeah.
Mary,
Oh, go ahead.
perhaps as part of this recommendation, we should refer to the charter as well.
Yeah, well, the Board of Finance has discretion over the purchasing policy and bid waivers. That's definitely, we're supposed to approve that.
See, a lot of
And at
bids,
one
though,
time, all bid waivers used to have to come to us. And when school building projects were happening, they would call us in on 24 hours notice to approve a bid waiver, or for the bus contracts, we used to do bid waivers. And we used to do those, quite often.
actually, I think we're going to do one in July, in our July meeting, a bid waiver. But also in the charter, one of the issues that we had was we weren't following the charter. The administration was not following the charter. Correct.
Right.
And so as part of the recommendation, one of them is to follow the charter, or maybe we have to look at the charter, because it's pretty, the charter is pretty tough about what has to go through, what has to go before the Board of Selectmen.
Mm-hmm.
Was it anything over $10,000? And, or if the contract was going to last more than 30 days, something like that.
Right.
And I think there was a distinction
and
between professional services and other purchases, right? In terms
Yes,
of
there
bidding,
is something.
Because typically, professional services, there's a different policy. You don't necessarily get bids for professional services, right? Like legal services or audit services, the overriding factor.
We do get bids for the
And
auditing
we do, but I'm just saying, I think the policy, either the dollar amount or the other parameters are typically different for professional services, because it's not necessarily in the town's best interest to get the cheapest lawyer, for example, right? You want the appropriate,
lawyer for the job.
with the right skills. So I just think that was a distinction, right? We had there was parameters around dollar amounts, around length of contract, around nature of service. And then the other thing that I think, if you think back to the Julian contract, that didn't have a lot of dollars involved, right? But there was risk associated with it that created financial exposure. It wasn't like we were paying them a bunch of money, right? They were paying the town. But obviously the contract or the RFP was complex, and it created risk. I mean, they were, there was risk that they would bring materials in, that would be contaminated. So that's another element that I think has to be considered, and that may not be related to dollars. It ultimately creates dollar exposure, But under
Right.
this policy, I'm not sure whether that would have fit into one of those buckets. And there needs to be, in my opinion, a bucket for that.
Right.
So I think the policy, the analysis, and the other thing, I mean, I guess we'll get into talking about the results of the testing, but the results of the testing only went through last year. And since there have been changes in personnel since then, I personally think it would be helpful if that analysis could be updated, whether the O'Connor Davies does it or whether internal audit does it. I think it should be brought up to date so that we can understand if some of these issues are still recurring problems. The things that could appear to be split bids, for example, or some of the other matters. Like one of the other things that caught my eye on page 29, if I'm reading this right, it's the finance department is not getting quotes. They're using vouchers when they're not supposed to. So, it seems like there's a lot of
They should know the policy, right?
Because that would be the group that's approving exceptions. And if you've got finance that's, inappropriately using vouchers versus getting quotes, that, again, problematic. So I think, maybe part of what we should understand, and I don't know if this is a phase 2 for the auditors or again, maybe something internal audit does, would be, I think, to extend the period of that analysis, but maybe bring in some departments outside of just public works.
Right.
And see if this is a widespread issue throughout the town. I don't think we didn't look at Board of Ed, obviously. We didn't look at, other departments. I'm not sure where he, this issue on page 29 where we talk about, the finance department, if that information was just obtained through, interviews, because it doesn't indicate that he did actual testing, but it does say here that we're using vouchers in a lot of circumstances that he would expect that there were quotes. So, I think some clarity around that would be helpful.
So it's the interpretation of the purchasing policy again, and I think the purchasing policy has to be more specific to give more situations on when you need to do something and when you don't need to do it.
Yeah. And documentation.
But I believe most of these findings, even though he was just looking at public work, I have a feeling they will be town-wide issues.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. And in a couple of places, he talks about documentation requirements too. So when they were doing their work, they had a lot of trouble finding quotes because we didn't, a lot of that stuff is maintained and not maintained, I should say. So, the purchasing department's going to write a purchase order and then they're having to go back for the quotes. So there's not a process in place to say, okay, I got 3 quotes. I'm going to scan them. They're going to go, be maintained, the purchasing department, et cetera. Yeah. So I think they did their test work. They identified what they identified, but they did point out that in some cases, they weren't sure if they had all the right documentation to work with, so they couldn't even be certain. Some documentation was just flat out missing. There were a lot of exceptions to the policies, I should say. And then, there was documentation there, but it was not maintained in a way that that was easy to get to. And I think that's what took them so long on the purchasing testing, was trying to figure out, since we had no system to file the quotes or keep the quotes attached to an order, finding the backup
So-
and
and
the
that
documentation was an
concerns
issue.
me because the person who has the ultimate authority to write the check and sign the check should get a packet that provides all of that information, that it went through that there's a purchase order and that the purchase order agrees to the invoice, and then the invoice agrees to the check and what we actually got, if we got what we're paying for.
Yep. Yeah, it says here on page 37, it says quote information may be noted in the notes section of the purchase order in the town's financial software, but the actual quotes are not being scanned or uploaded into the financial software in a similar manner as formal bids. The vendor sourcing notes don't print on the PO. So it's, it's hard to understand how you can really monitor or control around this when who's ever signing off on this stuff, may not have, all the data in front of them to be able to know that the process was followed.
And so maybe sometimes that was the situation, that it got to a certain point and the quotes weren't with the purchase order, so they had to go back and get them after the fact. And maybe that's why they're missing, or they didn't get them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think here it's on page 45. And this is on bids, but it says during our testing, we noted the bid log maintained by the purchasing department in many instances did not include the selected bidder's name or bid due date. Therefore, we may not have been able to accurately determine whether a purchase was bid properly. So part of the recommendations around updating the policy that they've put in here, which I think are good, are a standard form, checklist, set of documentation that has all the requirements, that it gets maintained. Who's ever reviewing and signing off on that is looking at, the same thing every time. They know what they have to have in front of them, and that's available.
Right. Consistency.
Yeah. Let me see if they're, yeah, the other question that I had asked, Joe to clarify at our last meeting. I didn't see it updated in here. I was trying to understand, so he gives us some statistics on the test work they did. Let me just pull up the final report. I think they're on page 36 of the draft. Just, yeah.
So far, your page numbers have all agreed. So
yeah, so Exhibit 2, which is page 36. And this was just, this is just sort of an overview of how much work they did, how many documents, they tested. But if you just sort of look at the total here, so look at POs, right? Out of 346 items they tested, 30 of them, or a little under 10%, we used a voucher. And that was one of the recommendations. That shouldn't be done unless there's kind of extenuating circumstances. No purchase order issued, so an exception, 38 of them. So, between those two items, 20% of the time, we had some type of issue with purchase orders, and that's a really high rate of exception. Right. And then invoices, same thing. 346 invoices, 38 invoices not properly processed. One got paid twice, but it got fixed. I mean, still over a 10% error rate on invoice processing, which again, so that's not to say we paid the wrong amount, but it's to say we paid somebody without having all the proper documentation. And then on the bidding piece, again, out of the 346 items, I asked Joe about this last time. This is sort of the 80-20 ratio. 20% of them show up as having, roughly 20%. So 72 out of the 346 items say that they were subject to bid and quote requirements, but we don't know if that's really right, because if we were, he said where he saw the pattern where you had a bunch of $2,900 orders going out, that's all lumped into the, it's classified as not subject to bid quote, even though it might have been. So the relationship there of how often we need to be bidding and quoting might not be 20%. It might be a much higher percent. We're just not following the policy because of the way things are getting done.
Right, because I thought if things didn't get bid, then you needed quotes, or you needed
the quote is
three different prices from another vendor.
Right. So the quote is if it's over $3,000, up to 15, and then over 15,000, it's a bid. But again, I think if out of what they tested, they said 80% of it was not subject to bid and quote requirements. But he told us that all of those that appeared to be split were part of that 80%. So.
Sorry, I got knocked off.
Jim, we
need to look at
looking at the statistics on Exhibit 2, which was page 36 of the report, and it just sort of illustrates that kind of the exception rate in all the testing that was done, which is pretty high in terms of exceptions around exceptions to our purchase order policy, invoices being processed without the appropriate documentation, and kind of the number of items we looked at that had, or they looked at quoting requirements. So, that's why I think it might be helpful to extend this into 2020 and see what's still going on. Again, given that, we've had a number of personnel changes.
What I would assume that it's all still going on. Because why would it change? Who would have changed it?
I don't know. I don't know who signed. Well, that's one of the things. Who's signing off on this stuff? I mean, if somebody's writing a bunch of making a bunch of $2,900 orders, I don't know if that is just, the thing that's done in the department, or if that was directed by, someone who's no longer with the department. So it's hard to say, but if it is still happening, I think the town should know.
It should be easy for them to check, right? It should be easy for finance to find out. They just need to take a look at what's been purchased and what the processes they're currently using. Because it also looks like they make purchases, as you guys were discussing right before I got knocked off the internet. They make purchases, then get purchase orders.
Yeah, get quotes after the fact, yeah.
They get quotes after. And it's probably because they're being asked. So they make a call and they say, hey, send me the quote.
Yeah.
That's why I think it's got to be, and it's going to take this new department head in finance, and I think maybe even the CAO a little bit to just dig deep in here. They have a roadmap with this, and they have to just, or we can help, we can work with them. What do they tackle first?
Yeah. I think they need a project plan around this. So whether it's the matrix will be simple, but there are so many recommendations in here, and there are so many issues. And as Mary pointed out, I think you did too, Jim, they're unlikely to be just DPW issues. And that's why I was a little hesitant when we talked about, phase 2, we've got there's a lot, I mean, we can do more audits, but there's a lot here to deal with. So to me, it would be helpful to, I mean, if we just can do more audits or increase the scope of them to the point where we're just getting more recommendations and we're just piling up things that there's not a real ability to start whittling down. I think, maybe you look at some of the most significant points here and then maybe delve a little bit deeper into a few of those to other departments, for example, particularly other departments that take in significant revenue.
Right.
Right.
Public, park and rec.
Park and rec permits. I mean, again, and I'm not suggesting anything's wrong there, but if we don't have, if we're taking in money in disparate systems and we've got this decentralized process to collect money, then there's no reconciliation.
Right.
In finance, it's just taking that one recommendation in here that was made in relation to public works and sort of fixing that across the board versus looking at other wholesale areas would be my thought.
So if you have a process here, once one's established for DPW, you would think that same process would be utilized for another department, right?
Yeah.
So they could start here. I think that's what you're saying, Lori, and then move on to another department. Or do you do them at the same time?
Well,
Because
if we revisit the the purchasing policy, and that has to be dealt with townwide, right? So, and I think the purchasing policy applies to the Board of Ed as well, right?
It applies to everyone, right? Every department, including the Board of Ed.
Right. So we're talking about revising the policy, standardizing the documentation around it, the controls around it, the reporting and the monitoring around it, training, that's.
But I think that goes to human resources then and onboarding and making sure once we have these policies, everyone's trained in the appropriate policies and they're refreshed. So maybe once every year or once every 2 years, everyone's retrained on what the policy should be.
Yeah. And maybe even, what's pretty typical in a corporate environment is if you're a department head or a division head, you're providing a representation periodically. You understand the policy and that you have abided by the policy and that you take responsibility for your department abiding by the policy, right? You'll sign some sort of reference, and that's just kind of built in. So it's, before you do that, you're thoughtful and you make it your business to know what's happening. So, right now we don't have, at least on the town side, that kind of discipline built in where it's okay, Mary, as you said, you're onboarded, you get trained, there's periodic reminders, somebody has to sign off on things, periodically, and maybe it's annually or whatever. A department head has to attest to the, the CFO that they're following these policies, et cetera.
Yep. So Mary, what else would you like to review? Are we firm on what this audit committee wants to handle? Lori kind of made some suggestions.
So I thought what Lori said earlier was very good, that we should, our focus should be on the financial policies and procedures. And so I would say that includes the purchasing and bid waivers and maybe cash controls and different things like that, and trying to oversee that those things get corrected. I don't know that we have to actually write it. If if you think we should give it a stamp, we can, because we can just, but I don't know how they implement the current purchasing policy. So I don't know all the details. Someone had went in and created a series of forms that the department heads fill out, and those don't, I think part of the problem was that those didn't actually all comply with the policy itself, if I remember part of the issue. So I think that part really needs, you know, someone needs to really start to write out the policy and the detailed pieces of it, and then we need to review it and make recommendations, and then bring it back to the Board of Finance for.
So if it's going to come back to the Board of Finance, maybe Chris would be willing to work with whoever in the administration and assist, or at least be a liaison.
Yeah. You know, another thought is that if, you know, and I know initially when the Board of Finance asked O'Connor Davies to do this was supposed to be, you know, step one, and we talked about perhaps for Don. I think it would be valuable to have the auditor's input, you know, in sort of a phase two or a smaller project, just to, you know, they could probably give us some recommendations. They probably have some stuff on the shelf that they could hand us as examples. And just to have them review the policy and make sure that it addresses, before it's finalized, make sure that it addresses all of the concerns that were in this document, A, but that B, and Mary, you just said this, that the, you know, kind of the execution of it, including any forms or, you know, all the supporting documentation supports the process as it's outlined, right? Because that's part of the problem. We don't have systems or documentation requirements that, you know, capture quote information, et cetera. So if we put this together and the Board of Finance reviews it, you know, maybe we can, you know, collaborate with, or, you know, ask the auditors for help, you know, and we have some agreed upon amount of time that they help us, you know, whether it's 20 hours or 40 hours or whatever. And that way, you know, we know that, you know, what we've got at the end is, you know, we just got another view of it to say that, yeah, this covers all the things that, you know, we would have recommended after having done all this work.
Right, and we may be able to reach out to other towns and see what their policies are.
And I think that's where Joe can help, right? Because
right.
He's probably seen this in, you know, for all his clients, and
over and over, right.
Best practice perspective, he can probably, you know, hand us some generic things, or, you know, redact policies, or even pull things that are out there in public that we might not know where to get. And, you know, the other thing too is, I think it may be worth, and Jim, just something to consider, is just, you know, even though the Board of Ed, you know, wasn't in scope, since they sort of operate separately, maybe to just, you know, have an agenda item at some point to maybe ask some questions based on what we found here, and maybe ask them to provide some analysis. You know,
can do that.
You know, particularly we talked about this, you know, kind of in the world of COVID, a lot of things are being done differently. Employees are working remotely. You know, we're shifting in terms of how things get executed from a process perspective, and that can create risks along with it. You know, because, you know, people may not be physically together or talking to each other, or they're just trading documents electronically. So, you know, some
sharing jobs, or
shifting jobs, things may look differently. So I think getting some input from their side, or maybe just asking for some analysis. So, for example, the analysis that we talked about, getting, which was, okay, provide us an analysis of, by vendor, of small amounts that aggregate, to something over the threshold of what you would have been required to quote or bid. That's something that, that might make sense to get across the board. I don't know. I'm just sort of throwing it out there. But I think we don't want to forget about the Board of Ed as we're looking at the policy, and we should make sure that whatever's being addressed here, since Joe didn't look at it, is practical and reasonable for them.
Okay.
All right.
So on July 7th, Joe will be at the meeting. Someone from finance will be at the meeting, or from the administration.
So we were going to have an audit committee before that. One, because it can finally be our first regular meeting where we can approve all our old minutes. But two, we have the opportunity, if you want, to have Joe, Caitlin, and Connie to begin to report back to us, or even to see if we can have a basic matrix set up for that meeting. I don't know if that's enough time for them to do it, but we can ask.
Yeah, I think that matrix is more a cut and paste job in this report. I think it's important because, like I said, it's just overwhelming. Like, the report's great because it lays out kind of the process and the background information, but I think having, the recommendations in one spot is critical, or we're just never going to be able to follow it and track progress on it. It's basically, it's a project plan to deal with this. And, it can have due dates on it, and, who's the owner, because there are going to be a number of different people that own this, particularly because it's not, it won't all be public works. Like, you may have one recommendation, but 6 departments have to implement it. And so.
Right. Well, even the way this is set up, there's quite a few different departments. Yeah. And as we know, like, the marina itself is budgeted in 3 different budgets. So it's in all different areas too. Different people have input on it. Public Works, Parks and Rec.
Yeah, they combined the marina budget this year. I wasn't sure though, as I read this, because I don't know if you guys remember, but there is now a new marina budget where they put in some of the different departments that were in various places. And that's one of the things that happened, I think, as a result of the conversation. So that's good. I just wasn't sure whether the new marina budget pulled in all of the different pieces that are referred to in here, because there are a lot of, there are a number of instances where, Public Works or police or, Parks and Rec, like, multiple departments kind of have their hands in an operation. And I think the reason for that recommendation was, like, no one's kind of looking at the whole thing, and that, in this case, the marina. So the marina did get pulled together in a separate cost center here, which is, but it's a $315,000 budget. Actually, it's less than that, because part of that was the capital piece that got cut. So I don't know if what we did here is exactly what was recommended. So, that'll be helpful to discuss.
Right. I think it was a start in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's still other departments that spend time working on marina activities. And I don't know that it makes sense to split them out, but yeah, so we can get some clarity from him on that recommendation. Because again, I think many of these recommendations, they did the testing on purchases, but a lot of this stuff, or most of it, just came from interviews. So it sounds like he's getting
Right.
feedback from from people in town that have some pretty good suggestions on some of this stuff. Or at least can recognize where we're
Falling short.
where we have opportunities. Yep.
Okay.
So just to recap, so Jim, for the Board of Finance meeting, the analysis of purchases, is that something that's reasonable to ask for?
We certainly can.
Okay. I mean, I think the matrix, again, if Joe got the town this report in a Word document, I mean, it'll take a few hours, but I think it's just a cut and paste job.
Yeah.
Put it into, and then you said you were going to talk to Chris about kind of the purchasing policy, and then do you want to give thought as to whether it makes sense to have the auditors involved in that process at the tail end, or?
Yeah, maybe even perhaps at the beginning.
Yeah.
So we get it, right first time.
Yeah.
And then also what we're going to handle as an audit committee, right? What we're going to focus on, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the administration has in store for them. By then they will have read this. Just coming to an agreement on what their priorities are, what they're going to go through first.
Yeah, so if we have that matrix with everything in it, we can, highlight or sort or categorize whatever the financial items that we would ask for updates on.
Right. And are we sure that we want Chris to be the one to go back for the purchasing policy? Or because he was the original writer of it, is it better for new eyes to work on that?
I'm open to any suggestion.
Yeah, I think you have to find someone willing.
Right.
Well,
start with that.
Yeah. Although, Mary,
Okay.
I think having Joe's input or the auditor's input
will help. Right.
That's, I think, good for the fresh eyes,
Sure.
particularly because we laid out the recommendations in here.
And Chris,
Right.
he
and
may.
he knows what the original intent was.
Right.
Yeah.
And we'll see if he has time. I haven't talked to him. But he may want to be involved.
Yeah, it's kind of in his wheelhouse as sort of.
It's in his wheelhouse, yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess the last thing is, and I guess we could talk about this at the next meeting, but I do think it's important to, extend the testing, because just the nature of some of these items, again, and what happened, if there are personnel issues involved here, we ought to know what the current state of affairs is. And who's, and listen, this may just be, I'm not going to make any assumptions. It may just be people don't understand the policy. They were told this is what they've always done, but the way the report is written, it seems like it's, we're kind of somebody's trying to get around the process. And so I think if this is still going on, it definitely should be, something that we understand, regardless of what department it's happening in, or that the administration understands.
We might want to wait on that a little bit, just because I know Connie has told us that she's been working on putting in new procedures as they have come up as issues. And so I think for this past year, we're going to have a mixed bag of things being implemented during the year. So to me, it seems like it would be better to try to get these policies implemented and then go back and test that they're working correctly and they're efficiently. Because I don't know that we want to do it twice and are we going to just get more of the same and it just be just too much information?
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just more, I think originally when this audit was requested, the time period that it covered, this happened after all the fill pile stuff, right? So I think
Right.
the time period was set for 2016, like after the contract with Julian was terminated up to 2019. And so it's just sort of it's this finite period. We didn't go back and look at history while the Julian contract was in place. And we haven't looked at anything since there were changes in the department. So and that's fine. I understand there's a lot here to digest, but I just think, and maybe the administration has a view on that, but, if there are, again, if there are personnel issues, we wouldn't want to be, I think it's just something that would be important to know and to be able to resolve, right? Whether it's through training or whatever else. But I hear you. I mean, part of it is just there's a certain amount. There's only a certain amount of hours in the day, and we have to prioritize. So
Right.
I could go either way on that, but.
Okay. So I guess, do we want everyone to come to the next audit subcommittee meeting, or do we just want a short audit subcommittee meeting to do our minutes and then just have Joe and Caitlin and Connie at the Board of Finance meeting?
I think the meeting in July may be more productive if they can make the next meeting. Maybe not. I don't know about Connie. Maybe, but Joe, so we could let Joe know what we're thinking as a committee.
Yeah, I think
this is coming.
Ask him about the purchasing policy, for example, rather than that hashing that out. We can make a recommendation to the full board.
Right.
And Jim, if you want to talk to Chris or whatever, but
right.
That,
I think that's right. I think when we have the Board of Finance meeting, we want to be prepared to make recommendations instead of trying to work it through. And then they can throw in their 2 cents and we can adjust accordingly.
Right. And I think if the matrix is ready, if the matrix is ready and the Board of Finance has the report and the matrix, I mean, I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in it. But, what we could perhaps do is, in that matrix, we'll have a more finite set of recommendations that are the financial pieces. And I'm sure there'll be some Q&A on that stuff.
Mm-hmm. So Mary, when were you thinking about meeting again?
Well, we have our regular meeting scheduled for July 7th at 6 o'clock before the Board of Finance. But it doesn't give us much time to finalize anything between the two meetings. So we have to, kind of decide now. I can work on, putting together maybe a list of what we just talked about. If Sheila could get us the minutes very quickly, and then I can just summarize stuff for us and then send that to you, and we can add other things that we'd like to recommend to the Board of Finance and then discuss it before the meeting.
I think on our agenda too, we have to officially add Jim, don't we? I don't think we did. Did we?
He gets to appoint to the committee, so I don't know that we have to add him.
No, but is there not? I mean, I'm just saying, should we do anything official there or no?
I
at
guess
the Board of Finance meeting, maybe at the Board of Finance meeting, I'll let the board know that Ed had Ed Bajan has resigned from the audit committee and I've taken his place.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
Because Jim just appoints anyway, so I don't think it's anything we do.
Right. So I'll just say, that's probably all I have to say.
No, I think it's just, it helps clarify so when we're
Well,
voting.
I think that I don't think the whole board knows that took place. So it's right to inform everybody.
Okay.
And I'll do that. Okay, so July 7th at 6 o'clock, Mary?
Yeah.
I think that'll have to do. I mean, that's coming up in
Right.
what, 2 weeks?
It's 2 weeks. Yeah. Well, that's
Yeah,
why
we will-
we rushed to have this
Right.
meeting because
Yep.
there wasn't a lot of time and there's a holiday in between.
So the 6th is yeah, okay. That's a Monday. Is that right?
That's a Tuesday. So we're meeting on the 7th, and that's a Tuesday.
Just
Got it.
before the meeting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have it. Yep.
Unless you think we should meet again before that. We can.
Depends.
What I'm going to do, because I will confess, I had, I did spend a lot of time reading through, I read through the report in detail twice, and I have a lot of notes to myself. The one thing I didn't spend a ton of time on is going back through the new prioritization that Joe gave us in the final draft. And I would just like to take some time to look at that. So I don't think we have to meet on it, but maybe that's something we can plan to talk to him a little bit about so that we're all on the same page.
Right.
Yeah, I think I'd like to hear his point of view on some of these things or his clarifications, because I had a little bit of a different perspective on some of these in terms of them being a financial matter versus a best practice. So those are some things we can just make. I just get a chance to do that, make notes to myself. And I can ask questions, or we can all ask questions at the meeting on the 7th. But I don't feel the need to meet again before that ourselves. I mean, happy to if you guys want to, but
I agree. I think we can get ourselves prepared, Mary.
Okay. Okay, so do you want Joe and Connie and Caitlin at the audit subcommittee on the 7th? Or are we just going to do our minutes and go right to the Board of Finance?
Oh, no, I think Joe should be at the audit subcommittee. Like I said, I would mind.
Okay.
Yeah, before the audit committee or Board of Finance meeting, just so as to not take up a lot of time at the Board of Finance meeting, I would just like to ask some questions and clarify on maybe, on sort of what the population is of the things that we're considering financial controls, and we want to have a more active role in monitoring.
Right. Okay.
And I think Caitlin would want to be there too.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. And I assume Connie, because I think a good part of this is going to fall on her lap. So I think it would be good to have her there too.
Yeah.
If she's available.
Yeah, and as you implied, I think she's already been in the mix in terms of writing some policies with some recommendations. So she can help put some, color around all that.
Okay.
And we should just make sure Joe has the right expectations. So So when for the Board of Finance meeting, are we asking Joe to present to the Board of Finance? And versus
That was the plan.
Q&A, yeah. So
That was the plan.
Okay.
To do an overview.
Yeah.
And then based on that overview, then perhaps we could, as the audit committee, we can review our suggestions right? Our recommendations. And then the rest of the board can weigh in.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. I think because he may want to prepare a shorter document if he knows he's got to present. And then, you know, I don't know if, you know, Jim or Mary, you know, you want to have a, would the intent be to have a conversation with him before the meeting regarding him assisting us with, you know, a
The purchasing and what have you.
policy?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because I mean, if he's got a chance to think about that, he can even tell us, you know, gee, I think it'll take me 8 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours. This is roughly what the cost would be. And, you know, at least we're not putting him on the spot without.
right.
So you'll
And I
call
mean,
him,
if there's
Mary?
anything, he's just starting his current year audit. So if there's anything you think he needs to incorporate into that audit, or look for, we can kind of guide him a little bit.
I know the other thing I want to ask. I guess, you know, there are some, he had, how did he word it? He said they were, okay. So he doesn't have anything he called a material weakness, but he just has significant deficiencies here, and he's got a few of them. So I guess it would just be helpful if he could explain to us if this, you know, now having done this, right, is this going to have any impact on their audit in terms of, and I assume it would at some level, right, from a risk assessment perspective or whatever. You know, are they going to be changing the work they do or focusing on different areas, or, you know, is this going to have any reporting implications? I guess the only thing that it could potentially is on this, you know, because they don't report on controls other than, I mean, the single audit doesn't even do that, right? So I don't.
Right.
Yeah.
And on materiality, they don't reach into the size of most of these findings.
Right. So what a significant deficiency normally means is that it's a deficiency that's significant enough to bring to our attention, meaning that you would talk to kind of a, you know, a governing body about it. So, which is what
Right.
it's doing. But I would like to understand, you know, knowing what they know now, are they going to, you know, modify any of their procedures? Because, you know, we never heard about any of this stuff as a result of the normal financial statement audit. And I get it. They don't test controls in the normal financial statement audit, but I guess I'm kind of surprised with the extent of issues that they identified on the expenditure testing that never came up during the regular audit. You know, if we're having a 20% acceptance rate, you know, are they, you know, is that, you know, what kind of work are they doing to test expenses in the normal audit, and does it not extend to these things? You know, maybe it doesn't, but it would be helpful.
They probably don't fully test the documentation to see, is what my guess is, that it just probably didn't come up, like it wasn't their testing wasn't deep enough to find most of the stuff. I wouldn't
expect them to be testing all the controls, but I mean, if they're testing expenditures and there's no purchase order or, you know, quote, you know, again, maybe that's just not part of what they do, but maybe he can just tell us that. Because again, I think it'll just help us understand if that's not part of what they're going to do, then that is helpful to understand, because, you know, we do have internal audit, and that may be an area that, you know, Connie does an annual review of or something. So, okay.
Okay.
All right. Sounds like we got a plan.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Anything else? Or should I call the meeting to a close?
I think I don't have anything else. Do you, Laura?
I do not.
Okay, I'll take a motion then to adjourn.
Me?
Okay, Lori and Jim seconds. Okay, thank you, everyone, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks.
All
All
right.
right. Thanks,
July
Mary.
7th.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you guys.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mary.
This session is no longer being recorded.